Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Harnish, Principal at Leap Forward Library Consulting. And it's my pleasure to welcome you again to Taking a Practice Trip, 3 Problems, 3 Solutions, Use Case Number 1, the 3rd webinar in our Orienteering for Libraries and Librarians series. As Nanette and I work through the 3 use cases that demonstrate the power of the PraXis transformation engine, we came to a very clear conclusion. We have a lot of content to share in this final presentation. There's so much content, in fact, that we became concerned about giving the use cases short shrift by squeezing them into an hour-long session. As a result, we've altered our approach to this webinar. Rather than hosting a live session, as originally planned, we've broken the content up into 2 webinars, an introduction to the use cases, and this session, a walkthrough of the first use case on metadata aggregation and enrichment. And we'll address the second 2 use cases on library as publisher and e-resource optimization via white papers to be published by the end of the year, as we feel that this is the most effective way to share what is fairly complex information about these topics. All of these materials will be posted to the IMT website under the Resources menu option, along with a copy of the slide deck and speaker's notes for the first 2 sessions. As always, we invite questions and comments via the Talk to Us link, also on the IMT site. So, let's kick things off, as always, with a quick round of introductions. I'm joined today by my colleagues from Information Management Team, Nanette Knott, Principal at IMT, and Kathy Sackman, Lead Analyst. Together, we're working on solutions to help libraries ensure ongoing visibility and viability in a web-based world. Nanette and Kathy bring extensive experience with product and content development, architecture, ontology, and modeling services for publishers, libraries, and their partners, while I've spent the past 18 years in various ILS product management positions at ProQuest, OCLC, and Ex Libris. Let's pick up where the PraXis use case introduction ended, with my call to Nanette to lead us through some real examples, with live, working software built with a microservices approach that helps libraries move forward in productive ways that facilitate discoverability, cost control, and collaboration. So Nanette, let's go.
Yes, Catherine, let's go. Let's explore how PraXis helps us increase discoverability by grabbing that appropriately packed bag from the introduction, just the tools we need now and nothing extra, and meeting our users where they are. Let's decrease costs, as you suggested, by staying on the trail and guiding our data down the path that makes sense for our business cases, our individual business cases. And let's change the way we collaborate, not to mention who we collaborate with, by booting up in a stylish, well-supported pair of mucks and wading into the deep waters of stewardship. How, you ask? It's simple, really. Start with commonality, or the need common to all 3 mandates: metadata, aggregation, and enrichment. Or, as Catherine's been referring to it, PraXis use case 1. So let's aggregate metadata. And rather than continue the time and cost-intensive recreate metadata cycle of our current cataloging and description workflows, as we discussed in detail in Orienteering for Libraries Session 2, Definitions. And I've included links in the slide notes to these pieces for cross-reference. And then let's enhance. Or to use Catherine's wording from the introduction, let's context manage for both intellectual and use context. And let's group like things against a predefined schema or classification scheme. Say pinks and browns to pinks and blacks, to pinks and browns to black, an interconnecting full circle, or perhaps turquoise and red, moving to the left of our scheme to turquoise and to the right with red. And let's continue the use of this boots collection. Let's continue our context management, and let's classify by type against defined ontologies, with or without subclassifications, synonyms, and related terms. Let's look at this in a bit more detail by returning to those boots. Dress boots, everyday boots, casual boots? Or how about favorite boots in Dorothy boots? Or what about creation technique for these boots? Hand-stitched, or machine stitched, or equivalent to stitched, extruded with a related term of molded. Or how about materials used to create the boot? Perhaps plain leather? And though it's really possible to go deeper into the types of plain leather, bull leather, calf leather, kid leather, in specialist areas, as determined by those individual business cases and communities served that Catherine talked about in the introduction, for the purposes of my example here, I've chosen cost as a key factor in the business case. So this level of detail isn't needed, as it adds cost without returning significant benefit to the bulk of communities served, and minimal, perhaps even negative ROI. For how many people think about these added distinctions as they proceed through their decision-making process? And worse, this added complexity could even confuse many of these people and delay their decision-making process, sometimes even causing them to walk away and choose another "thinks more like me" discovery and delivery service. So for our purposes, against our business case, we'll stay with plain. But we will add exotics, because again, cost is a big factor for us, and it's also a visible difference, like the color or the bindery of a book that people will remember, so it meets our business case. And we'll add those distinct sub-distinctions, like python, or lizard, or ostrich. And unlike python and lizard, ostrich actually has two sub-classifications, which are easily recognizable and seriously impact cost, which meets our business case: body, or the synonym of quill, and leg, or the synonym of no quill. Again, as we said, big cost factors and visible key differences our users can see that make it different, that they want as options in their boot discovery and delivery experience. And notice this is a bit of a different approach than many of our current description workflows. We're allowing varying levels of granularity in our enhanced boot data, as dictated by our business case. And we're doing that to control costs. And we're controlling costs by not blanket or just in case or just because the standard says to, enhancing the quality or the depth of all data equally. And we're doing this, as we've mentioned, to increase discoverability by meeting the needs of both those novice and advanced users from Catherine's introductory remarks. And we're doing this to decrease the chance they will go around our discovery platforms to find answers and the boots they desire in a platform that thinks more like them. And as we'll see in the working example, with PraXis, what we're really doing is enabling the business managers, those who understand both the existing and future business processes of library, to push, or not just include this data in their systems now, but publish this enhanced data out to those go-around platforms the users may desire without significantly increasing the costs at our library. We're allowing these business managers to do this as they feel their individual business cases warrant. But back to the enhancement. Let's do some more context management by tagging for intended use, which is a really good place to start bridging that gap between Catherine's intellectual and use context. And let's do this tagging for intended use against defined vocabularies that allow us to establish relationships between classifications and intended use, that allow us to accommodate overlap and multiple uses, perhaps with percentage ranking and audience sensitivity, as we're seeing both Google with its current Knowledge Vault work and OCLC with its linked data experiment do now. And yes, in the slide notes, I've included links to both so you can explore this in more detail. And let's return to our boots example again. And let's look at the big picture here in the center. We have intended uses of riding boots, with or without the modifier that we've been talking about of spurs. And let's note that spurs are a related thing that could have classifications of its own, outside those shown for the boot. Does this sound like linked data? Does this sound like what we talked about in session 2? But I digress into best practice, and that's a topic for another day. For more on modifier vocabularies, if you're interested, I've included a link to our RDA registry and product synchronization analysis that talks about this in more detail using the modifiers in RDA. So we have riding boots, and we have hiking boots. which, if you're part of the right population, which these are mine, I happen to be, I live in the country, could also have a second use of dancing. Pink camo boots, after all, are high fashion this year in local dance halls. And these pink camo boots or shoes have a third usage of hiking. They are Merrell's, after all. And with the identity management in place that we have, as we'll see in a few minutes, we can easily follow a link to the corporate body that produced these boots and see its areas of focus or specialization to discover more. But again, I digress into related things, and as I said, we'll hit on that a bit in the working example, and this is a larger topic for another day. What about dancing? Dancing is an intended use that for many audiences would overlap with the intended use of speaking. And speaking is also an intended audience that could overlap with dancing in some but not all instances. For you probably wouldn't want to wear sequin heels to speak at a professional conference. And I want to point out here, as I mentioned with these Dorothy boots earlier, they're not just speaking boots, they're Dorothy boots, and they have some pretty specific overlaps and related subject classifications, as we'll get to in a few minutes. Yes, intended use appears to overlap with other ontologies, related uses, and intended audiences. But as I said, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's close this out by talking about our last set of intended uses, those of the puddle jumpers, which, if you live where I do, up north, have a second intended use of wading. It's cold up here. And as their name, Mucks, implies, we followed that identity link. They have an intended use of mucking out stalls. That's what they were created for, after all. And finally, I did say my cost was my primary business case for this example. For certain very profitable and vocal audiences that happen to be in mine, show folks. Show folks use them to wash show animals. They keep your show pants dry on show day for those touch-ups before you head in the ring. Not to mention, make a fashion statement meant to intimidate your competitors about how much you're willing to spend on your show clothes. Nothing says you're the real deal, after all, like professional, first-class tools. We do well to remember both practical uses and status uses in our intended use vocabulary. After all, as Catherine reminded us, no advanced user, no researcher wants to use a K-12 tool to get their job done. And as any boot or car designer can tell you, form and function matter more than we might think. But I digress. Let's complete our context management or enhancement then by relating to audience, perhaps with relationships between groupings, uses, like those puddle jumpers, and audiences. And let's look at this boot collection again to explore the style of vocabularies we need here. Vocabularies like men, women, and either with a contextual synonym of both and with a related term of gender neutral. Vocabularies that overlap, as we can see, person characteristic vocabularies like gender. Vocabularies that we, or better yet the individuals themselves, also use to identify an individual as part of a specific audience. And yes, we could spend a lot of time arguing the academic minutiae of the term choices I've made here. But to what real in-system advantage? What would that afford us against our costs? For we're display labels, as we've talked about, of preferred synonyms, which, if we're honest, change with an uncomfortable level of frequency, not just across audiences, but within audiences over time. These display labels of preferred synonyms are easily and cost-effectively added and adjusted as appropriate to our business case in microservices interfaces, not in the data in PraXis. And added granularity or subdivisions can be added as appropriate to our individual business cases. As we've been talking about, they can easily be accommodated by the technology, the federated architecture, and microservices from Catherine's introduction. Not to mention, these things are part of the new collaboration Catherine also discussed. But back to vocabulary style, the style of the vocabularies we need, not just the terms included in them. Do we need to extend context to other types of users, even perhaps users like horses? Would extending our intended audience, and perhaps even our intended use vocabulary, to non-human things increase our visibility, ease of use, and utility? Increase these things in a way that positively impacts libraries' viability? Remember, I did say cost was the key business factor in the examples here. So let's go back to our boot one last time and consider the possibility for a moment of using that intended use vocabulary from earlier against a different context, the context of horses. And in horses, we would get riding like a human. However, unlike the human audience, in horses, riding overlaps walking. Though for specific specialties, we would include subclassifications like loping and extended related uses like reining. And yes, in this population, if horses or their owners are a key community, the cost factors of increased classification depth are outweighed by the service advantages, which increase visibility and viability in important ways with a key audience. And we have hiking and walking and puddle jumping. And in the case of this audience, horses, puddle jumping would overlap with treatment, which also overlaps in horses with removable shoes. But enough about the boots already, Nanette. Let's get to libraries specifically and out of these analogies. Okay, but humor me on this for just a couple more slides. I promise I'm relating it directly to library and PraXis itself starting right now. After all, don't these groups of like things against predefined classification schemes sound familiar? Hierarchical, jointed, and full circle with cross-references that bridge or relate categories like colors, which at first glance seem a bit unconnected. Aren't they just browse trees with interconnects like LCSH, like Dewey? Some of these browse trees that, like Dewey, straddle the boundary between classification schemes and subject ontologies, as we did discuss in a bit more detail in our first session of Orienteering for Libraries, the Landscape Survey, and I've included a link to that in the slide note. And don't these subject ontologies sound familiar too, especially to those metadata specialists among us who regularly classify with subject or discipline-specific ontologies, often outside that cataloging interface, in an XML or web tool like Oxygen and Dreamweaver? Aren't we talking about here true, fully documented, serialized ontologies that interrelate knowledge objects and their various parts in a number of ways, with both inheritance and containment hierarchies coexisting peacefully? Are we talking about not just the simple hierarchies of labels and tags with C and C also that we see in the classification scheme? To me, at least, we are, and it feels like the meshes of the world, not as we see in LCSH, but mesh as we see it as a standalone ontology in the discipline of medicine and its subdisciplines, and its related disciplines like insurance. And for more on this connection, please consult our white paper, use case number 3, e-resource optimization. We'll go into the mesh example with some specifics. And we'll look at planning here in a minute, as well as place. Planning and place, after all, are key ontologies in urban planning and its related sciences of architecture, GIS, engineering, with its applicable subclassifications of civil, mechanical, and electrical, and law, with its related term, as we'll see, in subject in the APA example of policy. But again, we'll be getting there in a moment. So let's take a minute to perhaps look at a display or an edit interface of how this aggregated enhanced metadata might look. And yes, perhaps I've oversimplified it here a bit. Perhaps this is more display than data-driven. And you might even comment that it's not standardized enough in that. But for my purposes here, what I want to show is what can be. More importantly, what is in a microservice with federated infrastructure system like PraXis today, not tomorrow, and how it's different from what we think of as library metadata records, not to mention what we see as library metadata records in our monolithic systems, tightly constrained interfaces today. So let's notice a couple of things. First, this is kind of cool. I, for one, would rather use this. It's certainly better than what I see on the web in Google today, or in any search tool for that matter. And it's a lot better than the OPACs and the discovery interfaces of our closed systems that don't really think like I do. It gives me just what I need in ways that I can easily understand with easy headings. It's simple and quick to use as well as to create. And that's an important distinction to talk about for a moment. It's simple and quick to use and to create. Wow, any business person can tell you that double punch is a quick ticket to ROI, not to mention customer loyalty. Decrease the time it takes your users to do their jobs, make them jump through fewer hoops, and bam, the threat of Google fades into the background very quickly. Viability is often easily achieved by providing your users with the purpose-driven tools they need to help them do their jobs better. In short, it's a win-win situation. Let's also notice that this is a very informative type of display. It's helpful for me, at least, as a metadata geek, to see, as I see in Courier here, where the data is coming directly, unchanged, from the record, straight from the data. It's helpful to see the display labels that we're seeing here in gray sans serif that have been added to help users, to help me absorb and interpret the information more readily, in ways the data itself unchanged can't. Those display labels we talked about again. And I really don't care whether these labels are explicit data fields or display labels, like those preferred synonyms for special populations we talked about within the booth, as are justified by our business cases. My only concern here is that these labels are helpful and speak a language I intuitively understand. I simply want the display to think more like me. And the links. Look at all the links. And here they're being displayed as they do in Word and all of the other tools I use to do my job daily, not in a special OPAC display. And they're present, sometimes with helpful floating labels about resource types that allow me to quickly determine which resource I want to go take a look at before I actually click the link, which is important if I'm on my phone and don't want to waste my data points to follow that link to find out. Again, helping me do my job better through your tools. But back to those last two enhancements briefly, before we jump into the PraXis interfaces full scale. And jumping back, we're coming with tag for intended use, as we talked about, against predefined control vocabularies. And let's simply note that when judged against our current cataloging and description practices and all those connections that we talked about in the booth with uses and audiences and classifications and subjects, those key facets of context management, we're not sure that what we're looking at with respect to intended use in our current library metadata. And honestly, we suspect libraries don't do this very well in the data. Rather, right now they do it in person, at the reference desk, using people to do what computers should do, thereby decreasing our ROI and increasing our costs due to using people to fill in a data gap. And we wonder, can PraXis help us bridge this gap? And we'll look at this in a bit more detail in those microservices interfaces. And let's look at that intended audience tagging against defined control vocabularies with relationships between group, uses, and audience. And let's note that while this concept matches the spirit of RDA intended audience, its current implementation isn't an ideal match to what we need. Its defined controlled, publicly available vocabularies feel a bit insufficient to successfully accomplish the tasks we talked about earlier in the boost examples. Its model, at the moment at least, seems poorly matched to actual, immediate library business cases, like the one I heard outlined last year at Charleston by a Denver library administrator who described in detail how her library now serves a four-year institution with several doctorate programs, area community colleges, and the public at large. Thus, her library now needs to not only make discovery easier for all the populations it supports, not to mention address those current discovery platform problems Catherine mentioned earlier, but also promote collections and authors, researchers across Denver's publicly funded institutions to show the positive, measurable statistics necessary to ensure continued funding and demonstrate good stewardship. For more about how funding connects to PraXis's definition of libraries, see our second session, Orienteering for Libraries, Definitional Alignment. And yes, I've included the link in the slide notes. Moreover, it doesn't meet a business case I experienced in detail with the American Planning Association, as we'll see in a minute. This association publisher needed to not only make discovery of its individual resources and product lines easier on its website, in its catalog, in its shopping carts, and for distributors and collectors such as libraries, but it also needed to promote unpaid and resale visibility of its publications to extended audiences outside the association itself. Audiences like NIMBY, you know, the not in my backyard folks, the public at large, and elected officials. It needed to do this to show the positive, measurable statistics necessary to ensure continued funding from members, sponsors, and its board, not to mention to achieve its overarching mission of good planning, discipline, stewardship. But before we dive into PraXis, a federated infrastructure that supports aggregation and microservices which enable enhancement of your metadata, as implemented for the American Planning Association in 2012, let's take just a moment to acknowledge. This is an individual case. It's a use of PraXis at APA, which is more than just library use case number 1, metadata aggregation and enrichment. At APA, PraXis was executed as part of the development lifecycle. It was and is integrated into this association publisher's content development and aggregation cycle, as we'll see in a bit more detail in Use Case 2's white paper, Libraries Publisher Support, and Use Case 3's white paper, E-Resource Optimization. Thus, all metadata here was created before release of the resource. I'll say that again. All metadata we're talking from here on out was created before release of the resource. Release of the resource for sale or distribution to libraries, or any customers for that matter. It was integrated into the resource itself against the same backbone as the content. Yes, I said that. It's not a label on the outside of the box of the resource. It's integrated into the content itself against the same backbone, traveling with the content as part of the resource from inception to final distribution, being added to, edited, and enhanced throughout the content lifecycle as appropriate to the individual product line and organizational business unit business cases, as we'll see in more detail in a few moments. And it was designed for use by non-librarians. These non-librarians were guided by a librarian super user and, as we'll keep seeing, library standards. They were trained to the task at hand, not necessarily the entire scheme, and they received minimal theory or technology training. They were trained to create library publisher and internal organizational metadata, such as membership and accounting system data, sales and shopping cart metadata, continuing education metadata. And as with some library business cases, this connection to other institutional systems was vital to their long-term success. Standing alone as the only non-integrated business unit due to silo-specific computer systems of library or publishing either was not an option, nor was filling in that gap in the data or the system with the expensive human interventions we often see in cataloging workflows today. For more on this individual business case and the APA project, and I've included the links, of course, see Taxonomy 101, Finalizing Our Trip, for a glimpse into the project plan, its timelines, and objectives. And see Taxonomy 201, Things Get Real, for a glimpse into the implementation itself, the staff training used, and its setup. So for our purposes, let's look more deeply at that backbone, that federated infrastructure that supports aggregation or the collection of metadata. Metadata of various kinds modeled in a variety of ways against a federated infrastructure, or as we fondly refer to here at IMT, the meaning machine, the code cracking backbone that drives all of the microservices we keep talking about. Seen here is a snapshot from the serialization's documentation. For APA resources, this means bibliographic metadata, which is probably self-explanatory to this audience. However, as we'll see in the microservices interfaces, it includes good ROI-driven reasoning. That's not a 100% match to MARC, AACR2, RDA, BibFrame, or any given cataloging template for that matter. Why? Remember our caveats. For APA, this is executed as part of the resource lifecycle. It's integrated into the resource itself. It's designed for efficient, accurate use by all. For library, it supports individual library business cases, including appropriate, cost-effective delivery of those needed services to key audiences we kept talking about in the booth. And it has, of course, authority metadata, or more accurately, identity metadata, which we'll see in the interface in a minute, goes beyond traditional library authority metadata. Again, remember those caveats. This data exists prior to collection and library cataloging. And subject metadata, or more accurately, classification scheme and discipline-specific ontology metadata. And transaction, or more accurately, sales and distribution metadata, what folks commonly think of as ONIX in the library world. And I will note that there is some overlap in this between bib and transaction metadata. The distinction is drawn not along, the distinction in a microservice, in fact, is drawn not along overlap lines between publisher and library metadata, ONIX versus MARC versus BibFrame, but rather along workflow or lines of business. If it's done in editorial, it's bibliographic in the microservice. It's transaction. Uh-oh. Dangerous overlap? Arbitrary distinctions? Perhaps to a purist. But to a business person, not arbitrary at all. It makes perfect sense. Follow the money. Base your distinctions for aggregation and enhancement on decision-making authority and define responsibilities and existent measured performance areas. And bam, there's that ROI again. ROI and accuracy automatically follow. And when they don't, which they sometimes won't, you have clear lines of accountability and rules for enforcement. No new extra policies, no new added steps required. But Nanette, you're a technical person. What about the technical point of view? Doesn't machine-readable data mean I, the human, have to do it like the computer wants it done, or else? Don't my business processes have to conform to its constraints, rather than vice versa, as you seem to be advocating? Well, yes. In your pre-SOA or current service-oriented architectures that Catherine mentioned in the introduction, those architectures in which your current systems live, yes. But we're not forced to eat SpaghettiOs out of the can cold anymore. So, no, not in a bridge environment like PraXis with its federated infrastructure and microservices approach. Like those cupcakes Catherine mentioned, this approach affords libraries and publishers, or anyone in the resource management lifecycle for that matter, the flexibility to customize to local needs without triggering a cascade of unintended consequences on the back end. To use audience-specific definitions, display labels, and formats, like we saw in my context management display a few slides back, without disturbing the pie slices. So what's the catch, Nanette? There's always a catch, after all. You're right. I guess the catch is definitions. All things, intellectual, physical, or otherwise, all terms, vocabularies, and objects used have to be defined, and defined in a usable, intelligible way. There's why we went to all that detail in Session 2, Definitional Alignment. And frankly, if we're honest, this is something library standards at the moment don't do very well. They're lacking more than a few definitions, as we keep mentioning. And all those definitions in all their versions, both audience and edit versions, in all their translations, with all their terms, with all their labels, display or otherwise, with all their synonyms, and with all their related terms, must be uniquely ID'd and interconnected, identity managed. So in other words, Nanette, what you're talking about is the justification for linked data. And we see here a picture from the linked data slide. One we don't see very much, but this is part of the standard. And what I'll say is, yes, we at PraXis think so. Which is, of course, why that identity management is so vital. Yes, it's the basis for those functional service groupings Catherine mentioned. Context management, rights management, and inventory management. And more to the point, all this is what we at IMT have been working on for years. Inside and outside content, inside and outside library. We work to see that our backbone, that PraXis Swiss Army knife, now and into the future, enables all these services and more. For more technical detail on how we do this time laid out against an RDA project, as I mentioned earlier, we have an RDA registry and product synchronization analysis that goes into it in some detail as a research paper on our website, and I've included that link in these slide notes. Or if you prefer to walk through it one-on-one with the opportunity to discuss your library's pain points and how PraXis fits your business case specifically, contact us at any of the emails listed on our website or at the end of this presentation. We're happy to do a virtual coffee walkthrough with you or an in-person chat at midwinter. We'd love to show you our work against your business case in full detail. Now let's get off the backbone and look at those microservices directly. Let's get down to the cupcakes. They're more fun and easier to understand. They're the parts all of us, even the non-code geeks among us, can touch. They're the parts that allow all of us, regardless of our place on that team we talked about in Session 1, a technologist, a cataloger, a manager, a business person, a work study student. They're the place that allow all of us to speak the same language. So let's use the Create Aggregated Metadata microservice to explore this collected metadata and its enhancement in a bit more detail. Let's start with enhancing bibliographic metadata. Notice the template starts with resource type. Why? Simple ROI and workflow again, based on the type selected from this drop-down list, which is coming from the backbone. The template turns on or off programmatically, automatically, based on your organization's product or business line policy. Required fields. Those in red. The fields are data points. Your record for this type of resource will not be valid if it doesn't include. Those fields that APA's internal policies, which is an APA example after all, will not let you submit the metadata record for review without. Yes, as we'll get to in a few slides, the idiot box mentality is in place here. Unless you're one of the select super user few, like that supervising librarian who have the override code. Why? Easy. ROI again. Something we don't talk about very much in cataloging interfaces. Something important to the business case. Get what you need, when you need it, from the person who has it. Make that business person from a few sides back happy to avoid having SpaghettiOs on her face. Optional, as we see here in gray. As we see here in black, not gray. Ideal, but not desired. Add if you have the time and ability to add. And back to that gray. Not applicable. Don't spend any time entering this. It's a waste of time. Values aren't allowed in those fields. What are we doing here? We're allowing people to not collect We're requiring them to not decide between core or optional, exception, and the like. After all, aren't all of these decisions usually made by the administrating librarian with tech stack input on what the system needs or requires to run well? And isn't all of this done before any actual creation or aggregation of metadata is attempted? So why waste the time having your staff consult other resources, remake decisions, or worse yet, like those overly fielded discovery people from the plain leather, generally confused? Why not automate? It's cheaper, faster, and less error-prone. It's as Catherine said in the introduction, and we reiterated a few slides back, letting the computer do what it does best, thereby freeing your people to do what only they can do. Notice, too, the mix of types in this dropdown. Yep, you're seeing it correctly. We have parts and wholes in there. That's to say, books, chapters, appendices. Yep, we have non-like things in there. That's to say, books and journals. Yep, we have new content and collections in there, both collected and derivative collections, books and handbooks, as we'll talk about later in more detail. Yep, it's possible we have a mess in there. We have a mess in there if you're judging by cataloging rules. Uh-oh, I thought you said there weren't going to be any SpaghettiOs on the face. Well, there aren't. We aren't judging this by cataloging rules. This is a microservice, not the backbone. This is a microservice, not the monolithic system. It's judged against ROI and workflow, business cases we keep saying. It's designed, purpose designed, for speed, accuracy, quality, and appropriate levels of human intervention. Things can and are mixed in this interface, in this dropdown. Things that are easily handled in the backbone against the specified standard. Things that the computers do better than people, such as control against the defined serialized list, no decision-making or thinking needed, only mathematical mapping. Things that, when done to serve the computer in an interface, often confuse and cause the human to make mistakes. Notice also the built-in toggle to and here from help. Does this help screen or any of its contents look familiar? Are we looking at policy statements here at the point of correction, toggling back and forth in the microservice as we need to from field to field? Policy statements without the overhead of programming into forms of your monolithic system or creating those standalone ones that take your staff time to consult. Yes, we are. And they're even linked to subscribe to resources and online tools like Toolkit and Cataloger's Desktop. Think about how you could use this extension to manage your business case against your required subscription seats for those. Most people just consult the policy. Only a few, at very specific times, need to go back to the original standard. Think about it. Where could you take functionality like this? Not just in the short term, in the small space of metadata enhancement microservice like we're seeing now, but in a discovery or delivery of any resource option or a usage statistics instance. What features could you bring back from those larger patron-facing Microsoft or microservices, should you develop them for discovery, but which you don't have the budget to provide similar in-staff services at the moment? How would doing this change your work team's life? How much more time might they have to increase the visibility and viability of your library if they could work in rather around their tools? But I jump ahead to the likes of Use Case 3's white paper e-resource optimization. Nonetheless, it bears consideration This is the type of thing federated infrastructures with microservices can and do now, today, routinely. No pie to make sure it stays together. No spaghetti to trace back. Let's jump back into the metadata enhancement interface and continue our scroll through then, the aggregated enhanced metadata. Notice we're using groupings again, just like in the backbone, just like in the boot. Groupings that work for people, business cases, and their individuality. Here we have book details, journal details, and research details. But wait, these aren't WEMI Nanette. These aren't the bibliographic description categories we're used to and trained in. We can't aggregate and enhance library metadata without those categories. Okay, first remember our ground rules here. We're measuring against business case, where cost is a primary factor. WEMI is expensive. We're targeting a librarian-led, trained to the task at hand, not necessarily the entire scheme with minimal theory and or technology training workforce. They don't know WEMI. They don't want to know WEMI. Knowing WEMI is expensive. We're letting the computer do what it does best to free the humans to do what they need to do to meet their business case of visibility and viability. And remember, as we've said before, we're no longer forced to eat cold SpaghettiOs from a can. We're in a federated infrastructure, microservices architecture here, not the pre-SOA or service-oriented architectures of our current systems, which, as we said before, allows us to do aggregation here, now, in a manner that meets the requirements of our current business cases and still support our current systems. Remember, PraXis is the bridge, not the new monolith, as Catherine noted in the introduction. We're dealing with cupcakes here that can and do support WEMI, MARC, RDA, ONIX, and all those other encoding standards and rules on the back end. In that hidden layer I talked about in Orienteering for Libraries Session 2, and yes, the link's in the slide notes. And yes, we need to show how this works in more detail, and we will, in that detailed white paper, Use Case 3, e-resource optimization. Want more? Can't wait for the white paper before the end of the month? No worries. Give me a call. Contact us at any of these links on this slide or on our website, and we'll give you a virtual walkthrough now. We're happy to answer all your questions in detail at your convenience. Now back to those intuitive user and system-friendly groupings. A couple more quick things to notice. These groupings work not only for users, without requiring, as I keep saying, extensive model training. After all, most of us know the difference between a book and a serial. Most of us would expect to find anything common to both, or things used by things that aren't a book or a journal, like streaming media, in the resource category. But they also work for the service, as they're a match to those reds, blacks, and grays, the required, optional, and not applicable toggles that are based on that user's first choice upon entry into our template. Let me catch back up to my notes here. Let's notice that in this scroll, let's acknowledge and notice that this service, this microservice, takes the new cataloging standards primal rule, the take what you see that Barbara Tillett talked about years ago, to a new level. It matches the entry or enhancement interface we're in here to what you see in the resource. If your resource doesn't have things like ISBN or ISSN in this case, when you think you're working with a journal article, one of two things is true. Either you're not looking at what you thought you were, and you made the wrong choice at the very beginning, or someone's made a mistake and not assigned the correct things at the correct time. Talk about error trapping and correction at the least expensive point in your workflow before it gets anywhere and causes problems, while still in the hands of the people with the knowledge, power, and responsibility metrics waited to correct the problem? This takes it to a whole new level. This puts the power of the business case, your business case success, in your staff's hands now. Not only that, it pre-populates fields like copyright statement and language with your embedded policy statement default, taking all that hard pre-data creation decision-making work you did and activating it where it counts, where it saves keystrokes, where it increases accuracy and decreased costs directly. Of course, with an overridable feature, sometimes limited to super users that we talked about before, sometimes available to everyone, that enables real-world policy enforcement by enabling them to edit as needed based on the resource in front of them. Notice this do not microsale checkbox. Certainly not something you've probably ever seen in bibliographic metadata before. And you'd be right if you said, Nanette, this feels very sales and marketing-y. It should be in the transaction wrapper. It is, in the backbone, as it impacts how the resource associated with the metadata in this template is sold and distributed. Think for a moment about DDA, demand-driven acquisition. If you want to purchase just the article with this metadata outside the journal issue or journal wrapper, how does the system know it's available? Easy. This toggle at the level you want to purchase inside the resource. The level we encoded up at the top with article, chapter, or image. But I digress. Back to why this is in the bibliographic record, this do not microsale. Remember the earlier workflow distinction of if editorial decision, then it's in the bib wrapper in the microservice, and if it's a marketing decision, then it's in the transaction? Workflow and decision-making authority, not cataloging standards, remember, dictates a grouping placement in the microservice. Why? To achieve better quality at lower cost. Or said another way, metadata in the microservice is aggregated, created, edited, versioned, and or updated at the point in the workflow where the person who cares most about the accuracy of this piece of metadata and has the knowledge to encode it correctly exists. And for a microsale, this person is the editor and or his staff, not the marketing people. These are the people that know the content best, where it can be packaged as sensible standalone units and where it can't. It's not a marketing decision, it's a knowledge decision. More importantly, it's a legal decision where these people know where the important legal, copyright or liability, where the important political, stewardship or author relations impacts, where those ramifications exist and where they don't. And this is the basis of the do or do not decision: knowledge, sensible units, and liability and stewardship. But more on this in use case 2, libraries publisher support. For now, take just a moment to think about what this type of information, when connected to other metadata, could do for your metrics, could do for DDA, could do for cost evaluations, and the like. Finally, this service meets Catherine's introductory requirement of collecting relationships in stream at the point in the workflow where the people who have the cares, the knowledge, and the decision-making authority to collect them most accurately and cost-effectively live. Notice related audience here with its drop-down pulled out. Remember, these drop-downs are fed by the backbone with all of those fully complete interconnected definitions we talked about earlier with their synonyms, audience, and preferred terms, as we discussed in the boot analogy. What we're showing here are the base terms, but they could just as easily, with all of these things, be the contextual display we talked about earlier. And they could just as easily be that without any significant cost or accuracy impact in the microservice or to your data collection. They could be display terms or definitions in preferred language, as is appropriate to the specific audience of the microservice. For the cataloger, they could be displaying as standard terms. For the work study students, they could be displaying as modern language terms they understand. For the patron, they could be tagging Thai romance novels. They could be categories in Thai instead of English. And yes, this last one is a real use case. There are public libraries that do this type of thing today, though admittedly not with a tool like this. Last time I checked, they were using their own Excel interface. Now, looking at a vocabulary like this, where what we really see is an extension of the RDA vocabulary audits with teachers, university students, university-level academics, recent graduates, and the like, as we hinted was needed a few slides back with the booth. And let's remember, when we're thinking about this is a 2012 interface. This is the type of information that's in ONIX, being coded now in things like this in ONIX and other pre-library metadata records now. It's sales data, as we said. It's being distributed. And we could, if we chose, access it as part of our acquisition process. What could we do if we did? If we picked up this metadata in our microservices bridge world, say in academic libraries who have faculty specialists like those from that earlier Denver use case, could we easily increase our visibility to them simply by using this type of metadata and microservice discovery interface? Might something like this be a better, more cost-effective solution than continued use of our current bolt-on discovery platform? I emphasize it here because it's certainly worth some thought about the immediate business case advantages that better metadata aggregation with a federated infrastructure in a microservices collection and enhancement template affords us. And speaking of business case, or definitions, and speaking of that business case, or use case rather, that started our microservice interface tour, one of the goals of APA was to promote expanded uses and sales opportunities. Consider just for a minute how these definitions of audience, when connected with this specialty vocabulary shown here, a type of intended use really, or at least an overlapping vocabulary, coupled with the audiences, as we said, provides metadata collection service that meets APA's key business case needs. These related audience and related use taggings, coupled with the earlier resource type with irregular granularity distinctions and the microscale notation we just went into, could meet the discovery and delivery needs of a university professor who's looking for new articles from a research journal to augment his textbook choice for use in his class packet, with or without library's publisher support. Sound familiar? Certainly we'll go into that in more detail in the white paper for use case 2, library's publisher support. Think too how this might extend your library's DDA service in an efficient manner with great usage statistics. How would services like this impact your library's bottom line and get your managers more support in the budgeting process from its key customers? And now consider for just a moment as we scroll down these related audience and related use taggings coupled with the earlier resource type with irregular granularity distinctions and related resources as we see them here. Could they meet needs like the new graduate who used that textbook and class packet, who's now in your audience in his first job and needs practical application tools rather than classroom tools to do his job better? Could they be used to recommend in your discovery interface the handbook, better known as the derivative work from his textbook, based on the textbook he used in class to help him now? Could they be used to help him find an extended, refuting, or supporting article from that class packet, enabling him to update what he learned in class based on current research through your discovery interface? Yes, let your imagination run a bit wild here. These aren't dreams for the future. These are things we can, and I would argue should, be doing today against our live business cases using aggregated enhanced currently available metadata. Remember, this is a 2012 interface that's been in use since that time in a specialty publisher. So we could do all these things without upgrading our current monolithic systems using microservices like PraXis. Wow. And all of this in just the bid section, Nanette? And yes, we're getting close to the end of our hour. So I'll click through the related screens here quickly. If you would like more on the related resource details here, because you can see we do a number of cool things, that's will be posted to our website in the added details related resources in the next few days. So as we quickly click through here, notice these identifiers. Yes, they match and are one and the same to those that were entered earlier in the section. And yes, if they're populated, and you're connected, there'll be a drop-down. Notice the relationship types. Do they look familiar? They're an edited, annotated version of the RDA derivative. That have been corrected for relationships like derivative work, remember our example above. They're in pre-library metadata, and they're very useful to our discovery interfaces if we quit filtering them out as we do. And now we filter out, as we'll see in our future use cases, things like derivative work in favor of collected work. And notice specialty here, connected to appropriate audience and interconnected with the definitions I keep hammering on. Yes, that's all present. And continuing our quick click-through with links to more detailed discussion on the IMT website, in this instance, related authority and identity metadata thought, let's take a quick tour through this microservices authority section. Notice the choice of relationship by the user, relationship or author type, at the beginning, just like in the bid section where we chose resource type. And we're choosing it here again as our first choice to garner all those opportunities and cost savings to meet our business case. Notice that definitions displaying live continue. Notice that we're collecting here not authority, not strings, but sync with data types and data divisions like we see here in the name. And remember that we have users with limited technical training, so we're extending our help with flyouts. Flyouts for places where we have a defined input need, and yes, they match the idiot boxes that are in place on that save function. Notice that it all continues to corporate body in the same way. Notice that we have specialties here, just like in resource, and remember those boots in the Merrill example earlier. And continuing our quick detail with links to more detailed discussion. In this instance, related subject metadata thought, here's a quick click through the microservices subject section. Embedded help continues, but look, it's extended with graphics where appropriate. This matches the training that was provided, which gave them a mnemonic for how they were to encode subject. And a comment about cost here, this was added with minimal cost and expense on site over lunch between the morning and afternoon training session when it became clear that folks needed this in the interface. And it was done in less than an hour. Remember, the graphic was done earlier as part of the training. All we needed to do was add it to the microservice and play it out to all versions of the template. Again, done in an hour, on lunch, between training sessions. Just wanted to take a moment to note what we're talking about here with respect to time and cost. So back to our walkthrough. And as we click through these screens, you can see that what we're really walking through is a decision-making process. Yes, we are in this interface, this microservice, collecting against the thought process, the knowledge structure, the ontology of the discipline of planning. And more on that in the detailed posting if you're interested. Notice too that we're collecting place, as we mentioned in the boots, and we're collecting it both as geographic and as a subject. We're talking about planning, places or subjects in their details. And we're using control vocabularies. And there's more on all of this, as I said, in the detailed posting about subject metadata. And in this horrendously fast run through, let's look at transaction. And as with the others, yes, there is a related transaction details posting if you want to know about this in more detail on the IMT website. Do notice here the consistency. We still have required optional and its automations. We still have vocabularies. We still have embedded help. Notice too Onyx vocabs are controlling here. We are in sales and marketing metadata by and large. And notice that we have all the webs and the enhancements and the versionings we used earlier. Onyx is the language of transaction, and remember this template is in use and is a couple years old. And yes, it uses Onyx 3.0. Why? It was the current standard at release. It still is. And as we'll see in use case 3, keywords optimization, though the standards are not officially backwards compatible, and Onyx 2.0, Onyx 3.0 or 2.0 for that matter to KBART is a lossy process, we can and do export back legacy data that's needed for your older systems in a package those systems find acceptable at realistic and acceptable quality levels. Sometimes actually from export, better quality levels than the data in the rest of your system, which can be its own issue, and yes, we can do a customization layer for that. Remember, PraXis is a bridge product, not a monolithic replacement. It's meant to connect your system, and it does. And see our white papers. That's why we decided to do white papers, was to talk about all this in a bit more detail. And speaking of maps, there is a map, as we can see by this trim size pull down, to dimension. Onyx collects size, RDA collects dimension. We collect it here in transaction because it's related to transaction, shipping, and distribution. And marketing people are the people that make those decisions. It's explicit here. And yes, in those maps, we downgrade it to library metadata. So I guess I want to say in this quick run through, please don't forget, like derivative products, sometimes we eliminate things we need, and sometimes we downgrade things that could give us better delivery experience of our users. After all, follow the money. Publishers know what it takes to distribute their product. And because Catherine mentioned in the introduction, yes, we do connect to those other outside systems, and I mentioned it as part of the PraXis, or as part of the APA business case. These are the product codes that connect to their ERP system. So let's take just a moment to talk about workflow and business case. And yes, there's more than one word about it. And yes, it all connects to that backbone and the linked data justification, which you can get in more detail in the downloadable piece, save, submit, and publish microservice workflow. And if you want to see how it fits into your specific business instances, call. Suffice it to say here, we'll walk through the button prompts in the service. And we'll note that this works on and offline, as you can see here we're doing with save. It allows people to save their work in progress if they need to go to lunch or start again tomorrow. It automates the submission process for review, and it prompts on both ends when the review is ready. And this part depends on or works with APA's internal systems, their security, their authentication, and the like. Yes, we did say this is a bridge. We didn't build these systems. They exist in their existing systems. We simply bridge to them. And it's feeding to their system and displaying stuff back through our interface. And as this pending shows, we're using the same template for all user types within a product line. So based on that authentication, a librarian or super user is the one doing the review here, and they do get a few more tools that get displayed, just like those required an optional turn on and off. And let's also note here, though we're not showing it, there is an alternate interface for those super users, those people like the metadata specialists among you that work in XML, scraping the data as needed. They can do that too, because remember, that backbone data is all right behind this. This is just a display interface against the backbone. It's a collection tool. It's not a data structure. Again, I'll say that. The microservice is a collection tool, not a data structure. And finally, to mention that authentication when we get to publish, publish moves it out to all those predefined areas. It activates all those scripts to immediately publish it to where it's needed and where it's been predefined by your tech team. Here, the master CMS collection point that serves their web, and the technical service archive with all of the audit trails and versioning that serves editorial. So one last thought before we close. A thought about overhead, maintenance, and cost. And for more detail on this, contact us. We have years of metrics and use cases by user type and work done. We have full documentation for both technical users and everyday users, some of which we referred to earlier with links to our website, but we have more. And we're happy to share any of this with you as it meets your use case and addresses your pain point. As this overwhelming amount of information shows, As we've had to change our process for delivering use case 3, we don't put them up because we don't have them. We don't put them up because we're afraid of overwhelming you. So for now, at the end of a long hour, let's just say what you have seen here was and is implemented. It was and is implemented in under 8 actual working weeks for the IMT team, spread across a number of months as it worked into APA-specific product, technology, marketing, and editorial plans, calendars, and budgets, the physical representations of their business cases, if you will, with allowances for their staff learning curves and knowledge transfer time. It was done so at a cost of less than $60,000 with less than 2 months post-release training and support between live release and today. That was 2012, summer of 2012, and I said with less than 2 months total post-release support. Yes, it is working. Yes, it is fast. Yes, it is inexpensive. Yes, it is extensible. Yes, it is capable of being run fairly autonomously by people doing their normal jobs once it's released. And yes, it is running at scale now. As we've said any number of times for this presentation, you want to learn more? Just contact me. We're happy to talk to you. We're happy to respond to your questions. We're happy to demonstrate working components and how it moves through from inception to implementation. Our time struggle in all these pieces is not we have to create it to show it to you. Our time struggle is simply how to best communicate what we have in a way that makes sense to you, the practicing members of the community. Or said in another way, how to best provide service to you. Don't hesitate to let any of us know how we can do this better and what you need to succeed. And with that, back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Annette. Hopefully this session on metadata aggregation and enrichment begins to make the capabilities of PraXis a little bit more concrete and to demonstrate that you don't need to wait for someone else to start developing the solutions that will give your library the visibility and viability it needs. The time for transformation is now, as I said in the introductory presentation. We need to get moving quickly before the fantastic opportunities of a web-based world simply passes by forever. Again, I hope that you'll take some time to review the white papers on the library as publisher and e-resource optimization use cases, which show how PraXis can be deployed like that Swiss Army knife to support other library needs. These will be published to the IMT site by the end of the year and will notify all registrants for the November 24th session of their availability. We're happy to discuss the needs of your individual library, as Annette said, for metadata aggregation and enrichment, resource creation and acquisition, and e-resource optimization, to roll up our sleeves and work through the ways in which PraXis can bring value to your organization. Just reach out to us via the Talk to Us link on the IMT homepage. On behalf of the PraXis team, I thank you for taking time out of your schedule to view this session, and as always, wish you visibility and viability for your library.